Hey guys, it's Amanda from Heartbeat Kitchen doing a little virtual cookie party with you guys. Today we're going to be making my gluten-free tahini chocolate chip skillet cookie, which is so amazing and I can't wait for you guys to try it. This live is sponsored by Watkins. They are a Minnesota company that's been around for 150 years. We're using their spices, their organic spices, their cinnamon and their nutmeg. Smells amazing. And then also their pure baking vanilla. So I'll talk a little bit more about them as we go, but if you want to chime in, say hi, where you're from. That's always awesome. I'll be answering questions throughout. If you have one, there's a little question box that you'll see come up on your screen. You can hit that and then I'll be able to see my questions come up and answer them. So I have that all set up. You guys also submitted some really great questions and about gluten-free baking, and I'm really excited to answer those because there was some super, great questions that I think are something that people get a lot of confusion on when it comes to making sure your baked goods, even when they're gluten-free, are delicious. So let's get started making this cookie. You can find this recipe on my website, heartbeatkitchen.com. I'll also share it after this, but it's really easy. I love this recipe because it's made in one pan. It's all in your skillet. If you don't have a skillet, you can totally use a pie plate. Something that can go in the oven that would be like a glass pie plate. And you just want it to be about 9 to 10 inches in diameter. That's what we're looking for. So my oven is heating up right now, and I've got my cast iron skillet here. And what I'm going to do is just add the butter to it and put this into the oven so that it melts the butter. So this is just 4 tablespoons of butter going in, and you don't need it to keep it in there, to keep it in the oven to heat up the pan. What we're trying to do is just melt the butter because everything else is going to be mixed in there. So you don't want it to be like scorching hot, right? But we're gonna cool it down too by adding the brown sugar and the tahini and whisk that together before we add the egg. So in this recipe, what I did is tahini, which is a sesame seed paste. So it's like a nut butter in that, but it's made from seeds. It's just, pureed, basically sesame seeds. And it has a really lovely nutty flavor that it adds, but it also acts as the fat content for a baked good. So in this case, instead of using all butter like you would in a traditional cookie, and usually like in a cookie recipe, you're gonna use a stick of butter. It's kind of traditional. So in this, it's a half a stick of butter, and we're using 1/3 cup of tahini. So if you have never seen what tahini looks like, this is what it is. It has kind of that light color. It's pretty smooth depending on the brand that you buy, but it should be runny like this. You don't want one that's super coarse. The times that, or the places that I like to get my tahini, there's a really great place called Seed and Mill that ships their tahini from New York. They're the absolute best, but obviously I can't always get that. So Trader Joe's has a really great organic tahini, and also Whole Foods has an organic tahini that's really great. So either of those works super well. If you aren't able to get your hands on tahini right now, which is totally understandable, any other nut butter should work great, specifically like cashew butter. And almond butter, if it's not too gritty, that would also work well, and even peanut butter. So use what you have, right? That's what we're kind of all about during this time where we're all not able to go to the grocery store as much as we want to. So I'm going to check on my butter and we'll see how it's coming along. Almost melted. So just give it a few more minutes. And while we do that, I just want to talk a little bit about when we get the dry goods. It's really important in gluten-free baking. I use a scale to weigh my flours just because every single gluten-free flour that you're using is a different weight, and so they're not one for one. So 1/3 cup of oat flour does not equal 1/3 cup of like something like almond flour in terms of weight. So it's really important to use a scale. For this recipe on my website, I did include both the cup measurements and the grams, but if you like to bake and you're gluten-free, I would highly suggest getting a kitchen scale. It's so worth every single penny and makes it much, much easier to bake and figure out all the variables. So in here, I have my, this recipe has a mix of almond flour. So we've got the almond flour here. This is oat flour here. I already put my salt in. And then I'm gonna put in my sweet rice flour. And we'll get to this because one of your biggest questions was, what gluten-free flours are best for what applications? And, you know, because there's a lot of them, right? And so I'm going to talk about that. So we'll add this sweet rice flour and I'll talk more about that. But let's pull out the butter. Okay, it's fully melted. Smells amazing. All right, put this here. And what I'm going to do is run a spatula. So we're also using this to kind of grease the pan, so I'm just going to run it up the sides a little bit so that the sides of the pan is greased as well. Okay, so now I'm going to add in, this is 3/4 a cup of brown sugar. And here is the tahini, which is so yummy. And we are gonna mix our egg into this, and the reason that you don't put the egg in right now is because that butter is hot and so is the pan, and so we would scramble our egg if we did that, and we don't want to do that. So now I'm gonna incorporate these together. And this is one instance where if your brown sugar is a little bit hard, this is gonna melt it, so it works kind of well that way. I'm gonna use a fork instead. Okay, so this is nice. It's getting nice and creamy. Oh my goodness. Major chunks of the brown sugar. You'll also notice with my baking recipes that I tend to go on the less sweet side of baked goods, just because I think in the United States we kind of over-sweeten everything. So when you make my recipes, I would say that you don't have to be worried about them being too sweet and reducing the sugar. Use the amount of sugar that I call for, because that is at a good level. All right, so that's as much as that needs to get set. I'm just still gonna let that cool just for a few minutes. It doesn't seem too warm, but just before we put the egg in there. So let's go back to our flours. All right, so sweet rice flour is a magical gluten-free baking flour. And it is different than white rice flour. Sweet rice flour is made from glutinous rice. It's not sweet at all. Glutinous rice is what you would typically find in like a sushi roll. It's very sticky. So the starch content of sweet rice flour is really, really high. And the beauty of that is typically in gluten-free baked goods, to keep something from becoming crumbly and too dry, the binding power is sometimes replaced by a gum, xanthan gum or guar gum. And I don't use any gums in my gluten-free baking recipe because there are a lot of people that are really sensitive to them. It's not a terrible ingredient. It's made from the fermentation of some sort of bacteria. It was developed in the 1960s. But I just think it's unnecessary. It's also something that, I don't think you get as good of results with the texture either. Whereas when you're using a whole ingredient, you're able to control the results much, much easier. So sweet rice flour is my go-to as the binder in most of my gluten-free baking recipes. So for this recipe, I believe it's, I need to look. I think it's 30 grams. I'm gonna go with it. I think it was like 1/4 cup. So I'm adding 30 grams. And if you don't have sweet rice flour right now, totally okay. Another great substitute that's a binder, it's not going to give you quite the same amount of binding ingredient or component, but it would be tapioca starch because that's also very starchy. And in this recipe, we're not using a ton of it. Sometimes recipes use a lot of tapioca starch and those can get dry because it just doesn't work as a combination as a balance of flours, and that's why, like in this recipe, there's 3 flours in this. The almond flour, the sweet rice flour, and the oat flour. So let's talk, actually let's add our egg, and I'm gonna mix these in so that we can talk about the other flours while it's baking. So now I have 1 large egg that's at room temperature. This guy's going in. All right. I'm gonna whisk him in. Okay. Now I'm gonna add 2 teaspoons of the baking vanilla. So this is a really great ingredient because it's a pure ingredient made, vanilla extract, but it's not quite as expensive as some of the other vanillas on the market. So it's such a great quality. I love using it. It's a great vanilla. And Watkins, that's what I grew up in my house. We grew up with Watkins vanilla. So I'm putting 2 teaspoons in here. I use the 1/2 teaspoon. All right, smells amazing. So excited to make this. Okay, so we've got that in there. And then I'm going to do the spices. So the organic ground cinnamon, which I'm putting in 3/4 a teaspoon. And I talk about this in the blog post, but you know how when you go to a bakery and you have something and you're like, well, I make something like this at home, but there's just something special about this one that I can't mimic. It's usually that they're using some combination of spices in their baked goods, and it's not enough to be like, oh, that's so cinnamony, but it's just enough to give it something super unique. So that's why we're adding cinnamon here. A little more for good measure, right? And so when you taste this cookie, it's not gonna be like, oh, it's overly cinnamon overpowered. It's just gonna be really deliciously spiced. And then I'm just doing a pinch of nutmeg to add some depth. And oh my God, I love the smell of ground nutmeg so much. Okay, so let's mix these in. Okay, and into my flours, I am adding 1/4 teaspoon each of baking soda and baking powder. So 1/4 teaspoon, that. I'm really proud of myself for not forgetting to put these in as I talk. All right, so we got that. Good to go. All right, I'm just gonna give these flours a little stir to combine them. And then I'm not gonna add them all at once. I'm gonna add them a little bit gradually. So, oops. And I'm gonna switch as I start mixing this to a fork because you're gonna see it gets thick, just like cookie dough does. So keep adding this in. And at this point, don't get scared that it's not coming together. It will come there. It's just you're doing all the work with your hands instead of using a mixer like we often do when we're making cookies. So all that in there. Now is when it gets thick like cookie dough. Just kind of grabbing everything from the sides and just pressing with the fork. I mean, how great is a dessert that's a warm cookie that only uses 1 bowl? I really love that concept. Put that in there. Okay, so you can see that that's came together perfect. That's just like cookie dough. Now I'm gonna add in some chocolate chips and save some for the top. And I'm just gonna kind of fold these in. Okay, that looks great. And I think I said this, but my skillet is a 10-inch skillet. You wouldn't want to use anything bigger than a 10-inch skillet because it's going to be way too thin and it's going to cook a lot faster. So you want to make sure that you're either at 9 inches or 10 inches with whatever you use. All right, so I'm just kind of pushing this into the edges of the pan. Doesn't need to be perfect, or it can be perfect if you want it to. Okay, and sometimes your fingers even work nice to press this out and make it really even. It's because there's enough oil in there, butter, sorry, not oil, to make it not stick to your hands. So that is looking fabulous. It smells fabulous. Okay, now we're gonna put our chocolate chips on top, and I'm going to just kind of press those in just a little bit. All right, now we bake. We bake for like 12 to 15 minutes. And this is at 350 degrees. And I'm gonna set my timer because I would probably forget. So I'm gonna set it for 12. You probably have experienced this yourself, but cookies are one of those things that, you know, 1 minute on either side can really make a difference in how done they are. So I put mine at the low end when I start just to check it. Also want to remember that with cookies, you're going to get some baking after it comes out of the oven from the residual heat that's in the pan specifically. So as that bakes, I have these great questions from you guys about gluten-free baking that I'm going to answer. Was there any other questions that popped up right now, or should I look?
Yeah.
Let's see. I don't really see any. Do you see any? Okay, cool. All right, so.
Let them know they can put questions.
Oh yeah, and you can also, if you just hopped in, you can put questions in the comment box. There's a little question box and it will pop up and I can answer them from there. But these are ones that you guys submitted, and one of the most common is, again, talking about substitutes, why to use certain flours in gluten-free baking. So I've been gluten-free for, I think, going on 8 years now. I have an autoimmune reaction that's just not good if I'm eating gluten, but I can eat sourdough because of the long fermentation process that breaks down the gluten strands. But in gluten-free baking, it takes a lot of testing and a lot of failures to get a recipe right. And what I want to talk to you about is, you know, the gluten-free one, like you can buy Bob's Red 1-to-1 or, you know, cup for cup flour, and those are great, but they do have gums in them because it does certainly make things easy, right? And that's totally awesome. But like I said before, I don't care to use gums, and that was one of the questions that I did receive too, is I don't like using gums. How can I mimic that reaction of how something feels and tastes when I eat it, and it's you know, a gluten-free baked good? So the real answer to that is a combination of flours is going to be your ticket to success. Typically, one flour on its own can't do all the work because there's a lot of things that gluten does, right? It adds moisture, it's protein, so it adds the stretchiness. It also binds to things, so it keeps it together, but also helps with the rise. And so when you think about it, when I'm recipe developing, I want something that's a protein, something that's a grain, and something that's a starch is typically how I will build a recipe, which is why you see almond flour, which is the protein in this recipe, the oat flour, which is the whole grain, and then the sweet rice flour, which is our starch. And so those three in combination are going to do different things. The almond flour is made from blanched almonds that are ground up, and so It's very fine. It's very moist because nuts are fat, so it's giving those things, and it's also creating this denseness. It will hold together too because it's moist, but not completely enough to be solely on its own. In a cookie, that goes for in a cookie. If you're making something like a cake, often almond flour and a lot of eggs are a great combination, but in a cookie it's different. Okay, so we've got our almond flour for our protein and for our also really great flavor, right? So then we come to oat flour, and oat flour is very light. It's going to also add structure because it's a grain, but I like to use it because it's fine and it's not gritty. When you use something like brown rice flour or white rice flour, those can typically be gritty even when they're fine ground, and I don't love using them much. And not to say I never use them, like they have their purpose too, right? So if you think of maybe like a shortbread cookie where you want a little crispness and you want some of that crisp texture, the fine, the gritty bits of that are gonna add that crispness with, again, a lot of butter. And then we have our starch component in here, which is the sweet rice flour. And it's my favorite to use because I think it mimics the chew and the softness of gluten, and you would never know the difference. And Brian can attest. He's not gluten-free, but all of things that I bake like this are absolutely delicious, and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference, which I think is winning the game. So like I said before, a substitute for sweet rice flour is tapioca starch, arrowroot starch. Those are all starches. I just prefer and think that sweet rice flour is the best out of all of those. Another great flour that I use a lot that's not in this recipe is teff flour. So this is another grain. And then sorghum flour. Sorghum flour has a really light, mild flavor. And so this would be a good substitute for the oat flour if you do have sorghum flour. Same thing, millet has a little stronger flavor, but in this recipe we're not using a ton of it, so you could substitute it with that. And then teff flour, I love teff flour because when you smell it, it has, which it's made from the teff grain, just these little small grains that kind of look like quinoa, but it has this like malty, sweet aroma that gives baked goods such wonderful flavor. And I think that part of also why I don't like to use the gums and maybe just one flour is because the diversity of the flours adds flavor components that are so great that you're not gonna get with just using one flour. Or like even I think sometimes when you're making a good that's not gluten-free and you're just using all-purpose flour, this is like kind of a gift, and that's how I started thinking about it when I had to become gluten-free, was all of these different ingredients that I really would have never known about had I not, needed to become gluten-free. So hopefully that helps answer a little bit of substitutions for this recipe, but also like what we try to achieve when we're developing gluten-free recipes. The other question I got is, what about coconut flour? Can I just substitute that for the almond? And coconut flour is one of them that is a very tricky ingredient because it sucks up moisture so much. And so any recipe you've seen coconut flour, and it's probably not a lot, like maybe even, for like the pancake recipe that I recently posted, I think there was 2 tablespoons of coconut flour in the whole thing. And that's because it will just take all of the moisture of whatever you're baking and use it. So it has its purpose. Like sometimes it makes an excellent banana bread, right? Because in banana bread, you have tons of moisture, and if you're baking it gluten-free, sometimes it can be gummy, and it's a really good way. But again, you're gonna wanna use a recipe that's trusted instead of being like, oh, I'm just gonna swap in some coconut flour here. That is one where do not use it unless the recipe calls for it, because it's not a good situation when you use that one. So like I said, coconut flour can be great, but it just depends on the purpose. So it would not be a good substitute for anything that we talked about here. We talked about the crumbly texture, and again, a lot of times when you make a recipe that it turns out crumbly, it's probably because there's just not a balance of enough starch in there. And it can seem like, oh, this is an easy recipe, it just calls for rice flour or whatever, and that's true. It might be super easy to make, but you're not going to get the results that you want to get. So that's one really good tip, I think, to keep note of. And then we talked about what flour combination to use to keep things moist and soft. So again, my go-to is the sweet rice flour for that. I was just going to look at more of my notes. I think we're all good on that. So we're just kind of waiting for our, let's check on her.
There was one question.
Ooh, she's looking real good. Yeah?
12-inch cast iron.
12-inch cast iron. Okay.
Can you go 1.5 recipe?
Yes, you could do that. You could go 1.5 of the recipe, and I think that would turn out great. Since you'd be doubling that, you would have 2 eggs if you're gonna, like the one recipe calls for 1 egg. Go with 2 eggs, even though you're only increasing it by 1/2 of a recipe. It will, you might just need to bake it a little bit longer, and it'll be really chewy and delicious, and it'll still be really good. So yeah, that is all good. I am going to get the ice cream. 1 second. Because ice cream is a must for this. Okay, so we talked about like tahini and all that kind of good stuff. So like I said, if someone tries it with almond butter or peanut butter, let me know, because I'd love to know what the flavor is like with that too. So, all right, we've got my handy dandy little, oh, we are ready to take our first look. Okay. This is looking amazing. I'm gonna give it maybe 1 more minute to get a little browner on top. I'm just gonna turn it up here quick. So, another thing to note about Watkins is, these are all organic spices, and I've talked about this in my blog post, but organic when it comes to spices is really important. I know, I always buy what I can in organic. I can't do everything, but spices, it's super important because sourcing is coming from all different countries, even in the US, and you really want to be sure that you can trust the sourcing of them. And what do you want me to
Just a facing forward.
Oh, facing forward, yes. Okay, so you just want to be able to trust where they're coming from, and that's what I really appreciate about the Watkins line, is they have over 40 organic spices that I'm going to be developing recipes around this year. And the other thing that you can also know when it's organic is that it's non-GMO, but also all of their extracts, everything that they make is no artificial flavors, no artificial coloring, no corn syrup, any of those things that shouldn't be in a spice or an extract, they're not in there. So I just feel really good about using these in my kitchen. You can purchase them on Amazon or through their online shop, Watkins 1868, and they're a really great partner. So I'm super happy to be baking with them today, and they're Minnesota, and I'm Minnesota born, so we're coming to you from Hudson, Wisconsin. We're just across the border, but still my roots are there. So, all right. I think it's good enough we'll let it sit. We'll top it with some ice cream so you can see how lovely it melts. Okay. They also, Watkins 1868 has artificially free dyed sprinkles. So their sprinkles are made from vegetable coloring, which I think is super, super awesome. And I just feel like that would be a really fun topping for this as well to put on there. So let's do this. Let's do this thing, right? The moment of truth. Oh man, now I gotta get, this might be a little difficult. Oh, all right. Another ice cream flavor that I think would be delicious on here is coffee. So if that's your thing, put some coffee ice cream on there. I think it would be really lovely. Okay. This is probably gonna be way too hot. But if I put some ice cream on it, maybe it won't be. Okay. So good. I also was so excited about it that I even forgot to put tahini on top, but we should definitely do that. Put some tahini on top, drizzle that on top. This is not the greatest drizzler, but we're on live TV. Not live TV, Amanda, it's just IG. But it's such a simple, delicious recipe. I can't wait for you guys to try this. Like I said, it's on my website, heartbeatkitchen.com. Right on the homepage, you'll see it right now. And let me know if you do make it and what you think. And if you had to do any substitutions, what you had to do. And yeah, shoot me any other questions you have. I will see you guys soon. Thank you so much for tuning in and have a great rest of your Tuesday.